She saved a lost boy, and little did she know that, years later, he would be the key to an unexpected destiny. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. On a cold winter night, the kind of night when the biting wind seemed to want to strip away any remnant of human warmth from the deserted city streets, Maria walked hurriedly, trying to shorten the journey back home. The day had been long and tiring, like so many others, and she longed for a little rest. She worked as a cleaner in an office building, and although the work was hard and poorly paid, it was all she had. For Maria, each day of work meant a meal on the table and a roof over her head, even if that roof was old and leaking. The streets were empty, except for the occasional headlights of cars passing quickly. Maria pulled her scarf up, trying to protect herself from the cold, while her thoughts were lost in the daily routine. It was difficult to keep her spirits up amidst so many difficulties, but she kept going, one step at a time, as she had always done. However, something that night was about to change her life forever. As she turned the corner of a dimly lit alley that she used as a shortcut to get home faster, Maria heard a sound that made her stop immediately. It was a cry, weak, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Maria's heart began to beat faster, and she turned, trying to locate the source of the sound. The crying came from a dark corner of the alley, where the light from the lampposts barely reached. Maria hesitated for a moment, her instinct telling her to move on, not to get involved in something that could be dangerous. But compassion won out, and she approached the sound, her steps cautious. When she got closer, she saw an abandoned basket next to a pile of trash. The crying was coming from inside the basket. With trembling hands, Maria pulled back the dirty blanket covering the basket, and, to her astonishment, found a baby, a little boy with big, frightened eyes who couldn't have been more than a few months old. He stopped crying for a moment, looking at her with an expression Maria couldn't define. It was as if he was trying to understand who she was and why she was there. Maria felt a wave of emotions flood her: compassion, fear, anger at the cruelty of whoever could have left such a helpless child in a place like that. But above all, she felt an immediate and inexplicable connection with that baby. Without thinking twice, she picked him up in her arms. The boy was so light, so fragile, that he seemed like he could break at any moment. He started crying again, but this time the sound was softer, as if he was already getting used to the new warmth he felt. "Shh, it's all right now," Maria whispered, gently rocking the boy. "I'm here. I'll take care of you." With the baby in her arms, Maria knew she couldn't just leave him there. She looked around, hoping to see someone, maybe the person who had left him, but the street was deserted. The thought of going to the police crossed her mind, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the fear that the baby would be placed in an orphanage or given to someone who wouldn't love him, as she knew she already loved him, even though she didn't fully understand that feeling yet. Determined, Maria held the boy close to her chest and made her way back home. Her apartment was small and modest, with old furniture and walls that needed painting, but it was a safe place, and, that night, it became a home for two. Maria put the boy in her bed and covered him with the only blanket she had. He was already sleeping deeply, as if he finally felt safe. Maria sat down next to the bed, watching the boy sleep. Her thoughts were in turmoil. How would she take care of him? She had no money, could barely support herself. But looking at that sleeping little face, she knew it didn't matter. She would do whatever it took. She would call him Pedro, a simple but strong name that she had always liked. And from that moment on, he would be her son. In the days that followed, Maria did everything she could to take care of Pedro. She learned to be a mother in the most practical way possible, reading books borrowed from the library and listening to advice from other women in the neighborhood. It wasn't easy, and there were times when Maria felt totally overwhelmed, but the love she felt for Pedro overcame any challenge. He brought a new light to her life, a reason to keep fighting, even when everything seemed impossible. Each day, Maria felt her bond with Pedro grow stronger. He was a healthy and happy boy who quickly began to smile and crawl, always curious about the world around him. Maria worked hard to ensure he had everything he needed, even if it meant sacrificing her own needs. And although the work was tiring, Pedro's smile when he saw her come home made it all worthwhile. Maria knew their life would be full of challenges, but she was determined to give Pedro the best life possible. She loved him like she had never loved anyone, and that love became the strength that drove her every day. Even on the toughest nights, when Pedro woke up crying and Maria felt exhausted, she found comfort in knowing that no matter how difficult the circumstances, they were together. Pedro, in turn, seemed to understand, even at his tender age, that Maria was his protector, his mother in every sense that mattered. He followed her around the house, always wanting to be close to her, and Maria, despite her tiredness, never failed to smile at him. They were a family, against all odds, and that was all that mattered. Life went on with ups and downs, but Maria never regretted her decision on that cold night. Pedro brought joy and purpose to her life, and she knew that as long as she had him by her side, she could face anything. They would face the world together as mother and son, and nothing could change that. The years passed like leaves in the wind, each bringing new challenges and new joys. Maria's small house, which once seemed so empty, was now filled with the sound of laughter and Pedro's unstoppable energy. He had grown quickly, transforming from a fragile and frightened baby into a curious and lively boy. Maria watched him explore every corner of the house, always with eyes shining with excitement, and felt that, despite all the difficulties, she had made the right choice on that night she found him. Maria's routine was not easy. She continued to work as a cleaner, cleaning offices during the day and sometimes doing odd jobs at night to supplement her income. The money was never enough, but she always found a way to make it stretch to cover Pedro's expenses. He needed clothes, food, toys, not many, but enough for him to have a normal childhood, at least as much as possible. Pedro, in turn, was an extraordinary boy. From an early age, he showed keen intelligence and an insatiable curiosity. He wanted to know how things worked, why the sky was blue, where electricity came from, and Maria, even when she didn't know the answers, did her best to encourage him to find out. They spent hours together at the public library, where Pedro lost himself among the books, absorbing everything he could. Maria made a point of being present at all the important moments in Pedro's life. Even if it meant sacrificing her own needs, she never regretted it. She remembered her own childhood, marked by the absence of maternal figures, and vowed that Pedro would never feel that lack. He would have the support, love, and guidance that she never had, and that was what motivated her to continue, day after day. Over time, Pedro started attending school, and Maria felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as she watched him leave with his little backpack on his back. It was a new world for him, and although Maria knew he was ready to face it, she couldn't help but worry. What would the other children think of him? Would he feel different, as she often felt? But to her surprise and relief, Pedro adapted quickly. He made friends easily, and his teachers soon noticed his intelligence and enthusiasm. Maria strived to give Pedro everything he needed, even if it meant working harder than she ever imagined she could. She enrolled in night courses to learn new skills, hoping to get a better job and provide a more comfortable life for Pedro. During these years, their relationship grew even stronger. They were not just mother and son, but also best friends, inseparable companions on a journey full of challenges. Despite her own difficulties, Maria never allowed Pedro to see the weight of her struggles. For him, life was a great adventure, and she wanted him to continue seeing it that way. They spent weekends exploring parks, visiting museums, and, whenever possible, going to the movies. These moments were precious to Maria, as they were a temporary escape from the difficult reality they faced daily. But reality was always lurking, and Maria knew she couldn't protect Pedro from everything. The neighborhood where they lived was humble, and Pedro soon realized that not all children had the same opportunities as he did. Some of his friendships were brief, with families moving away or facing difficulties that Maria knew all too well. Pedro, despite his young age, began to understand that life wasn't fair for everyone, and this awakened in him a strong sense of justice and empathy. Maria saw these qualities grow in Pedro and felt proud, but also a growing concern. The world out there was harsh, and she feared that Pedro, with his generous heart, might be hurt by it. But she knew she couldn't protect him forever, and that part of being a good mother was allowing him to face challenges on his own, even if it filled her with anxiety. Despite financial difficulties, Maria never let Pedro feel inferior or less loved. She always found ways to make him happy, whether with a special dinner, a story read before bed, or simply spending quality time together. Pedro never asked for much, but Maria made sure to give him everything she could. However, Maria and Pedro's life was about to change in a way that neither of them could have predicted. On a day that seemed like any other, Maria received a visit that would shake the foundations of the small family they had built. When a well-dressed woman appeared at her door, with a serious look and a firm tone of voice, Maria immediately knew something was wrong. The woman introduced herself as Beatrice, a private investigator hired by a wealthy family who was looking for their lost son. The ground seemed to disappear beneath Maria's feet as Beatrice explained that all the clues led to believe that Pedro was, in fact, the missing son of this family. The shock was so great that Maria had to sit down to absorb the information. How could it be possible? She had always known that Pedro had a history before she found him, but she never imagined that this history could be so complex. Beatrice handed Maria a folder full of documents, photographs, and detailed accounts. The photos showed a baby who, indeed, bore a striking resemblance to Pedro. The documents told the story of the family who had lost their son during a trip years ago and never gave up looking for him. Maria was stunned. Pedro was her son, the boy she had raised and loved. The idea that someone could appear and take him away from her was unbearable. Beatrice was careful to explain that the family didn't want to take Pedro away from Maria. They wanted to meet him, to know that he was well, and perhaps, if possible, to build a relationship with him. But to Maria, this seemed like a veiled threat. The idea that Pedro might choose to live with another family, no matter how rich or influential, filled her with dread. That night, Maria felt the weight of a responsibility she had never experienced before. How would she tell Pedro? How would she explain to him that his life was about to change in such a dramatic way? The fear that Pedro would want to leave, that he would prefer the luxurious life his biological parents could offer, consumed her. But deep down, she knew she needed to be honest with him, regardless of what it meant for the future. Pedro, always sensitive to Maria's emotional state, noticed that something was wrong. He watched her in silence as she prepared dinner, her movements slow and thoughtful, and finally asked what was going on. Maria, with a heavy heart, told him everything. The words came out with difficulty, but she did her best to be clear and honest. Pedro listened in silence, his face reflecting a mixture of confusion and curiosity. When Maria finished, he was quiet for a long time, processing the information. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and firm. "Mom, I want to meet them, but you will always be my mom. Nothing will change that." Pedro's words brought immediate relief to Maria, but also a deep pain. She knew that, although Pedro wanted to maintain his relationship with her, the presence of this new family in his life would change everything. But at that moment, she decided to trust Pedro and their unshakable bond. Together, they would face whatever came. The days following Pedro's meeting with his biological parents were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. From the moment Pedro decided to keep in touch with Sarah and David, Maria's life changed in ways she had never imagined. It wasn't easy to accept that another family was now part of Pedro's life, but she knew she needed to be strong for him, who deserved the chance to know his roots and understand where he came from. Sarah and David, in turn, were incredibly respectful of Maria's position in Pedro's life. They never tried to usurp her place as a mother. On the contrary, they wanted to work together to ensure that Pedro had the support and love of everyone. Finally, Maria managed to whisper a simple, "Thank you," feeling that anything she said would be insufficient to express the complexity of her emotions. She knew that Sarah and David were not her enemies, but the reality of sharing Pedro with another family was still incredibly difficult to accept. Even so, she realized that the true focus should be Pedro, his needs, his well-being, and his desire to know his roots. And as painful as it was, Maria knew she would have to make room in her heart for this new reality. When the meeting ended, there was a heavy silence in the air. Sarah and David hesitated before saying goodbye, as if they didn't want that moment to end. But at the same time, respected Pedro's need to process everything that had happened. Pedro, in turn, maintained a calm expression, but his eyes revealed the depth of his thoughts. He hugged Sarah and David politely, but in a restrained manner, and Maria realized that despite everything, he was still trying to understand how to feel about them. On the way back home, Pedro was quieter than usual. Maria knew he needed space to process what had just happened, so she respected his silence, although her heart was full of questions. She wondered what Pedro was thinking, if he felt a connection with Sarah and David, or if he was confused and divided. It was difficult for Maria not to worry about the future, but she decided that the best thing to do would be to wait until Pedro was ready to talk about his feelings. When they got home, Pedro finally broke the silence. "Mom, I like them," he said, his words slow and measured. "They seem like good people, but at the same time it's strange. I know they're my parents, but I don't know them. Not like I know you." Maria felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. She knew that the bond she had with Pedro was strong, but she also understood that he needed to explore this new relationship with his biological parents. "I understand, Pedro," Maria replied softly, "and it's okay to feel that way. You have every right to get to know your biological parents, and it's natural for that to take time." Pedro nodded, still looking thoughtful. "I want to get to know them better, but I don't want that to change what we have. You will always be my mother, and that will never change." These words, simple and sincere, were like a balm to Maria's heart. She knew that the future would be full of uncertainties, but at that moment, she felt that regardless of what happened, the love between her and Pedro was unshakable. They had been through so much together, and Maria was determined to continue being Pedro's safe harbor, even as he navigated these unknown waters. In the days that followed, Maria noticed that Pedro was more introspective. He didn't talk much about the meeting with Sarah and David, but she could see that he was processing everything carefully. He spent more time alone, reading or drawing, activities that always helped him think better. Maria, in turn, gave him the necessary space, but was always available to talk when he wanted to. Eventually, Pedro began to talk more about his feelings. He admitted that he was curious about Sarah and David's life, about who they were, and what it would be like to have a relationship with them. However, he also expressed fear that getting too close to his biological parents could somehow distance him from Maria. This was his biggest fear, and Maria made sure to assure him that this wouldn't happen. "Nothing can change what we have, Pedro," she told him. "You can have two families and love them both. This doesn't diminish what we feel for each other." Over time, Pedro began to feel more comfortable with the idea of spending time with Sarah and David. They scheduled regular meetings, some visits to their house, walks in the park, and even family lunches. Maria always made sure that Pedro knew he had all her support, and gradually, she also began to feel more comfortable with the new dynamic. Sarah and David made a point of including her in many of these activities, and although it was still difficult for Maria, she appreciated their effort to create an environment where Pedro could feel loved by everyone. During these meetings, Pedro began to learn more about his origin. He discovered stories from his childhood that he didn't know, heard about the dreams and hopes that Sarah and David had for him before his disappearance, and began to understand how much his absence had impacted their lives. These conversations brought up many emotions, both for Pedro and for Sarah and David, but at the same time, helped build a bridge between them. Maria, observing from a distance, often felt divided. Part of her was happy that Pedro was connecting with his biological parents, but another part couldn't help feeling displaced, as if she was losing an important piece of her relationship with him. But every time Pedro came home and hugged her with the same tenderness as always, these insecurities dissipated. Maria knew that the love between her and Pedro was strong enough to withstand anything. Over time, Pedro's routine began to adjust. He divided his time between the two families in a balanced way, and although he was still adapting to the new reality, he seemed to be finding his way. For Maria, this was the most important thing. Seeing Pedro happy and secure in his decisions gave her the strength to continue facing her own insecurities and fears. At that moment, Maria realized that, as painful as it was, she would have to accept that Pedro was growing up, that he was building new relationships and discovering more about himself. But at the same time, she knew that there would always be a special place in Pedro's heart that was exclusively hers, and that gave her comfort, even amid the uncertainty of what the future would bring. As time passed, the dynamics between the two families began to stabilize. Pedro, now more secure in his relationship with Sarah and David, began to spend more time with them, but always made sure to reserve special moments for Maria. He understood the importance of balancing these two parts of his life, and at some point began to realize that he was actually lucky to have so much love coming from two different directions. Sarah and David, in turn, proved to be respectful and understanding of Maria's role in Pedro's life. They knew that, regardless of their biological bond, Maria was the mother who had raised Pedro, who had cared for him in his most vulnerable moments, and who had made him the man he was becoming. They had no intention of replacing Maria, but rather joining her in the mission of providing Pedro with a full and happy life. Maria, who at first felt a deep fear of being replaced, began to realize that this was not the case. In fact, she realized that the presence of Sarah and David in Pedro's life did not diminish her own role, but complemented it. This brought a new perspective to Maria, who began to see Sarah and David not as rivals, but as allies. Together they formed an unconventional but incredibly strong and united family nucleus. Pedro also began to see the benefits of this new configuration. He discovered that he could share different aspects of his life with each of his families. With Maria, he had the security and stability he had always known, the home that had welcomed and nurtured him since he was little. With Sarah and David, he experienced new adventures, learned more about his origins, and discovered new facets of his identity. For Pedro, this combination of experiences was fundamental to his personal growth. The coexistence between the two families was not without challenges. There were moments of jealousy, especially when Pedro seemed to be closer to one family than the other. Maria, for example, had to fight against feelings of inadequacy when she saw Pedro relating so well with Sarah and David. She feared that, over time, he would prefer to spend more time with them, especially considering the resources and opportunities they could offer. However, Pedro made sure to reassure Maria whenever he felt she was worrying too much. He told her that, as much as he loved Sarah and David, their relationship would never change. Maria was his mother, and that was something no one could take away from her. These words from Pedro, spoken with such sincerity, helped strengthen Maria's confidence and allowed her to relax a little more about the whole situation. Sarah and David, in turn, also had to face their own challenges. Although they were immensely grateful to have found Pedro and for him being willing to accept them into his life, they also felt the weight of their absence during all those years. There was a sense of guilt and regret that sometimes emerged in deeper conversations. And Pedro had to deal with these complicated emotions, both in himself and in his biological parents. Over time, however, all these complex emotions began to calm down. The two families learned to communicate better, to express their concerns, and to support Pedro in ways that made sense to him. They began to spend more time together, not just separately, but as a big family. There were dinners where everyone gathered, group outings, and even holiday celebrations where both families were present. These moments of unity helped solidify the understanding that Pedro didn't need to choose between one family and another. He could have the best of both worlds, and the two families could work together to ensure he had everything he needed to be happy and successful. For Maria, this was an important lesson. She realized that love was not something that ran out, but that could grow and expand, involving more people and creating stronger bonds. Pedro, in turn, began to flourish in his new reality. He excelled in school, showing a special talent for social sciences, and began to think seriously about his future. Inspired by his own story, he decided he wanted to help other children who, like him, had lived through difficult situations. He began to take an interest in social work and volunteering, dedicating his free time to helping others. Maria felt immense pride in seeing Pedro follow this path. She knew that regardless of what he chose to do, he would always be guided by a kind heart and a strong sense of justice. This was one of the qualities she most admired in Pedro, and knowing that she had contributed to the development of this quality gave her an enormous sense of accomplishment. The coexistence between the two families also brought new challenges and lessons for Pedro. He learned to navigate the complexities of family relationships, to understand that love can be shared in different ways, and that there is no problem in having multiple sources of support and affection. This understanding was crucial for his emotional development and for building his identity. Over time, the small insecurities that Maria still felt began to disappear. She saw that Pedro was happy, balanced, and secure in his decisions. And that was all she ever wanted for him. Maria also began to appreciate more the moments she spent with Pedro, knowing that despite all the changes, their love remained constant. This new phase of Pedro's life brought many discoveries and challenges, but it also provided growth and maturation for everyone involved. Maria, Sarah, David, and Pedro formed a solid and loving support network, which allowed them to face the uncertainties of the future with confidence. For Maria, seeing Pedro thrive was the greatest reward of all, and she knew that, no matter what challenges the future might bring, they were ready to face them together, as a large and united family. As the years passed, Pedro's new family reality solidified, bringing with it a deep sense of peace and fulfillment for everyone involved. Time, which once seemed so uncertain and full of challenges, now served as a testament to the love and resilience that had guided each of them to this point. Pedro, who was once a boy full of questions and uncertainties, was now transforming into a confident and determined young adult, ready to face the world with the same courage that had characterized his journey from the beginning. Pedro continued to excel in his studies, especially in the areas of social sciences and psychology, which soon became his passions. He saw in these fields an opportunity to better understand the complexities of human relationships and to help those who, like him, had faced difficult situations. His desire to make a difference in the world grew every day, and he began to consider the possibility of studying social work or psychology at university. Maria, who had always been Pedro's biggest support, encouraged his dreams with all her heart. She saw how much he cared about others, and knew that regardless of the path he chose, he would be successful and make a difference in many people's lives. For Maria, Pedro's success was not only in his academic achievements, but in the wonderful person he was becoming. That boy she had found on a cold night, now grown and ready to conquer the world. Sarah and David, in turn, also became actively involved in supporting Pedro's dreams. They helped guide him in his choices, offering resources and advice based on their own experiences. Pedro, who now felt comfortable and secure in his relationship with his biological parents, began to seek their opinions and value what they had to say. This new family dynamic, where everyone contributed to Pedro's well-being and future, brought a sense of fulfillment to everyone. When the time came for Pedro to apply to universities, there was a feeling of anticipation and anxiety in both families. Maria, although proud, couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness at the thought of Pedro moving to another city to study. She knew this was part of growing up and that it was a natural stage of life, but the idea of seeing her son leave, even for a good reason, was difficult to accept. Still, Maria never let her own emotions interfere with the unconditional support she gave Pedro. Pedro, on the other hand, was excited about the prospect of going to university. He saw this as an opportunity to expand his horizons, to learn more about himself and about the world. However, he was also aware of how much this change would mean for Maria, and made sure to assure her that, despite the distance, they would always be connected. "You will always be my mother, and that won't change," he told her several times, and Maria clung to these words to find strength. The university selection process was intense, but Pedro was accepted into several of the best universities in the country. After much reflection and discussion with Maria, Sarah, and David, he finally decided to study psychology at a university known for its strong social sciences program. The decision brought a mix of emotions, joy, pride, and a hint of melancholy, but everyone knew it was the right choice for Pedro. On the eve of his departure for university, there was a big family gathering at Sarah and David's house. Maria, who initially felt a little uncomfortable with the idea, ended up realizing that this was an important moment for all of them. Pedro was the link that had united these two families, and this celebration marked not only the beginning of a new chapter in his life, but also the consolidation of all the bonds that had been formed over the years. The night was full of laughter, memories, and emotional words. Pedro made sure to thank everyone for being by his side, for believing in him, and for giving him the strength to follow his dreams. He knew that without the love and support of Maria, Sarah, and David, he wouldn't be where he was. Looking around, seeing the faces that were now so familiar and dear, Pedro felt a deep sense of gratitude and love. When the night came to an end and goodbyes began, Maria felt the weight of the moment. She knew that the next day Pedro would leave for university, and the house would be a little emptier, a little quieter. But she also knew that this was the journey he needed to make, and that the bond they had would not be broken by distance. In fact, she believed that this bond would grow even stronger, as Pedro faced new challenges and continued to grow as a person. On the morning of departure, Maria woke up early to prepare Pedro's favorite breakfast, something she had done since he was little. The smell of pancakes and coffee filled the small kitchen, bringing with it a sense of normalcy amid the emotions of the day. When Pedro came down for breakfast, Maria noticed that he was calm and confident, ready to face what was to come. "Are you ready?" Maria asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Pedro smiled at her, that smile that always made her feel that everything would be all right. "I am, Mom. Are you?" Maria took a deep breath before answering. "I'm ready, Pedro. I'm ready to see you conquer the world." After breakfast, they prepared to go to the train station, where Pedro would catch the train to the university city. Sarah and David met them at the station, bringing with them words of encouragement and love. There were hugs, kisses, and inevitably tears. But the tears were of joy, of pride, of hope for the future. When the train finally arrived and Pedro boarded, he looked back one last time, waving to his two families who were now gathered on the platform. Maria felt a wave of emotions, but above all, she felt pride. Pedro was starting a new phase in his life, and she knew he was ready to face any challenge that arose. She also knew that, no matter how far he went, there would always be a special place for her in Pedro's heart. The months that followed were of adaptation for everyone. Maria, although she missed Pedro every day, found comfort in video calls, messages, and letters he sent. Pedro made sure to share every new experience with Maria, to tell her about his classes, his new friends, and the things he was learning. Maria, in turn, continued to support Pedro in every way she could, sending packages with treats, books, and small mementos that she knew he would appreciate. Sarah and David also remained close to Pedro, occasionally visiting him at the university and offering him emotional and financial support. Pedro, who now had such a strong and diverse support circle, began to flourish in ways he himself had not anticipated. He became a leader among his peers, known for his empathy, intelligence, and dedication to social causes. In the spring, Pedro returned home to spend the holidays. It was an emotional reunion, with everyone gathered to welcome him back. Maria noticed that Pedro had changed a little. He was more mature, more confident, but he was still the same Pedro she knew and loved. They spent the holidays together, enjoying every moment, and Maria felt a deep satisfaction in seeing the young adult Pedro was becoming. On a sunny afternoon, while they were sitting in the garden that Maria had cultivated with so much care, Pedro looked at his adoptive mother with a serious and loving expression. "Mom, I wanted to thank you for everything, for finding me that night, for raising me, for loving me. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." Maria felt tears beginning to form, but this time they were tears of happiness. "Pedro, I am the luckiest person in the world to have you as a son. You have brought so much meaning and joy to my life. I'm so proud of you." As they sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the sun and the love they shared, Maria knew that, regardless of what the future might bring, the bond between them was unbreakable. They had overcome so many challenges together, and now they were ready to face whatever came next. The journey they had begun so many years ago was nowhere near over, but Maria knew that as long as they were together, nothing could bring them down. At that moment, surrounded by the flowers they had planted together, Maria and Pedro felt a deep and lasting peace. They knew that the future was full of possibilities, but they also knew that the love and resilience that had guided them this far would continue to sustain them, no matter what lay ahead.